tivemos alguns problemas técnicos com a conexão
do technical problems connecting to President Fernando Henrique. Timothy Power is now going to begin the interview. Thank you. Sorry about the technical hitch. Thank you. President, thank you for your patience. Pupils that organize this event, they're very skilled and they know how to work out these problems with great patience. Let us talk a bit about governance in times of crisis. As a minister, as a president, you've witnessed different crises. There was the Asian crisis and others. Would be the first a governor should take when he understands that a crisis is approaching? Well, I think the first thing to do, you've got to bring in those who understand the matter. After all, if it's a world crisis with the economy, you've got to call in those experts, those who understand the subject, understand what you're talking about. It's one thing. I remember when I was president, well, actually it wasn't me, it's when I was head of the Treasury. He asked me to head the question and all the decisions to be taken in terms of the economy. The central bank had good experts. So what was my role? It was to explain to the population what our aim and to explain it. I was known. It was a fairly precarious approach, but I had to explain to people, the people who didn't understand anything. So I would go into the auditorium and I would explain precisely and in a very straightforward and simple way. I explained to them what was going on. And that was the program. So I think that's very important. If there's a crisis, you've got to have leadership. You've got to have the capacity to communicate. You've got to explain what the route is going to be, how you're going to deal with it all, different aspects. Perfect. Now, thinking of the two crises at the same time in Brazil, the economic crisis and also the health crisis, how would you consider the performance and the role of the current presidents in these two aspects? That is to call in the right people to advise him and how to address the public. How do you think Bolsonaro is doing with these two aspects? All right. Right. Sorry, there are several voices. Okay, obviously, we are now doing the necessary. We're now trying to communicate, but what with the newspapers and etc., you've got to have the executive power, you've got to have the government explaining. Now, what is missing today is government. So I think it's a very, very impolite way that it's being conducted today. And on the whole, the government is a bit lost. And it had an approach. And that approach would be, of course, they were going to organize the fiscal scene. But of course, now with what's happening, it's impossible for them to continue. They're going to be spending more and not less. The budgets are bust. And we don't know what's going on. People are without jobs, unemployment is increasing, the pandemic continues, and where are we going? What's going to happen? I think political leadership is the most important thing right now. You've got to find a way to explain what you're doing, how you're moving forward. Even if it's very little information you've got to share it with the people. I think there's, again, a big gap between the people and government. Thank you. Talking about leadership, currently there's discussion in Brazil about a possible escalation of authoritarianism. Some observers are saying that possibly in Brazil, this is the case. Others say the Brazilian institutions that control across the board, they are democratically controlling, are seriously inefficient to confront any crisis. What's your position in this discussion as to the capacity of the institutions to face escalation of authoritarianism? Well, I was a victim of authoritarianism years ago. At the time, in the world, there were two poles. There was the West and there was the Soviets. Those were the two poles of power. Now we don't have that. Right now, I think what we have is a lack of vision of the actual reality of the world, and also a national vision of the reality. There may be authoritarianism, but I just don't think the government has its own project. In '64, when the military came in, they were more conservative. They were afraid of the left, and they were quite right. Let's face it, the world might be coming in to give certain support, so we're watching what Brazil was doing. So they were nervous. But right now, we don't have that fear. So what we have now, we're beginning to see an ideology of being a strong hand. Now, this question of democracy, how is democracy and the institutions going to function? I mean, if you look in the USA and the UK, we know how they function. But the fact is, for some time now in Brazil, compared to what I witnessed in previous decades, you have to have freedom. But the Congress has assumed certain positions. Certainly within the Chamber of Deputies, the positions are being adopted. You have to have confidence in dealing with institutions. But there's one problem. There's one fear of the coronavirus. There's no reaction. You have demonstrations, etc. They're small, but there's no popular reaction. Why isn't there a reaction? I think that what you were saying, this risk to democracy, the epidemic, what would I have done as a senator, etc.? Democracy was young at the time when I was younger, and we had to look at it every day. But democracy is going to prevail, depends, of course. But it has to be defended. Because defending democracy, and I agreed with this and many others. Yesterday, there was almost a symbolic attempt within the federal court without the major authorities being there. But there has to be a reaction. And you feel that the institutions want to react. But in these difficulties, this difficult time, what is fundamental is to have solid positions adopted. Of course, there's the military, and I don't think it's like '64. I don't think the military have the project they had in '64. They want to take over power. No. They know there's a constitution. But recently in a network here in Brazil, it's a bit slippery. The ground is slippery at the moment. You may want to do something, but they don't have a project, but they may have one. They may come up with one. And there has to be a reaction if there's a danger to democracy. So I don't see any signs of this. I don't think freedoms have been shut down, but I think there's a lack of orientation on the part of the government. The economic crisis began with this, and now there's a health crisis. A great deal of attention has to be paid to this. There always needs to be attention paid, because if you talk about freedoms and democracy, this always has to be defended. Your friend, Guillermo Donald, who was also a teacher, who sadly died, he talked about two types of death to democracy: a sudden death, like a military coup, like the 11th of March, '64, and a slow death, which has no particular fixed date, which is a process of erosion, and it's gradual. Now in Brazil, if there were to be a slow death and erosion of democracy, what would the indicators be that we'd have to keep an eye on to see if indeed we crossed the line? Well, there's an American author who, how democracy died. There was a time of coup d'etat, and there was capacity then to conduct a coup. But when the government can no longer operate the Congress, and there's no force or command to operate Congress. So when you see that measures are being taken that move towards authoritarianism, what we're seeing are certain rhetoric, certain expressions are being used. Rhetorics which goes in the sense of authoritarianism. It's like a threat. You don't actually feel it yet. You don't actually feel he's got the sword in his hand, but there is a capacity to make the institutions bow before him. I sincerely hope that we can move forward without this, but it's going to depend very much on reactions, perhaps within weeks, a reaction. I think the federal court, again, today acted strongly. After yesterday, there were declarations were made by ministers who are beginning to understand that they have to raise a voice, but I don't say that's the right way forward. Because the treasury crisis that we had in Brazil, the idea was that they came in to put order to the fiscal sector. Public debt was growing immensely. Unemployment was growing. There was a lack of confidence. If there's no confidence, this is bad. And if democracy is rolling around inside this, it really is due to the incapacity of those in government to find another way to deal with this. If you can only do it with authoritarianism, that's not good. You have to find a different project, a universal one. And the president must lead that kind of project. You can't mess it all up. It's dangerous. Thank you. You mentioned the relationship of the president with Congress, and that leads us to the second section of our questions. This coalition presidency. Bolsonaro was a candidate to the presidency. He used to talk about the old style politics, composition of offices and partisanism, but now he wants to embark on a new policy or new politics to build up coalition in Congress. How would you assess this difference between the old type politics and the new type politics? Is there something here that's credible, or is it just a strategy? Is it going to be okay? When I was president, Clinton was the president in America, and of course we used to discuss this. I went to the USA and discussed this kind of thing with him, and I occasionally spoke to other leaders on the phone, and to see how this was being handled. In Brazil, we feel that this is not a very nice way to proceed. Negotiation. The exchange of ministerial posts, etc., changing one thing for another, getting a benefit. So I think for Bolsonaro, there's a lot of corruption, and he is following a negative agenda. No to Lula, no to the PT, disorder. And I would like to see an affirmative agenda. And with democracy, then you got the Congress, and the Congress reacts according to public power. But when I was president, I knew the Congress well, but you've got to be aware, you've got to talk to leaders, you've got to talk to people. And leaders, well, the Congress members are not always in favor of that route entirely, but you've got to look for advantage. Not all of them are going to support, but you need support in Congress. So having relationship with people in Congress became something not very attractive. But it's got to go beyond just being ideological, because this business of changing positions, since he came in with a new way of looking at things, and it's neither new nor old. The correct way would be to consider that there's always law. The law is there, but negotiation in the right sense. What's the right sense of negotiation? There are values. You look at a program, you look at a project, right? If you don't have a majority, a participating government, why? You've got to have a project. You've got to be able to bring Congress with you. And this is lacking. We don't know where we're going. You've got to have a basis for negotiation. You've got to talk about a decent presidentialism. And the time before that wasn't thought of. This has been happening over the years. When there was a dictatorship, when it was an authoritarian regime, the public didn't know what was going on. But to be valid, you've got to be able to say things to the people and explain things to them. Not, if you don't explain why, it's not a question of old or new politics. There's right or wrong. You have to give support for something, and people will understand that type of support. Congress has to give support as well. The easiest type of negotiation with Congress, Bolsonaro, it's difficult to negotiate. He was against any type of negotiation. He said he was against, and now he's negotiating in terms of denunciations and accusations, etc. It's all very delicate, but I think in the past we exaggerated in Brazil. There was a great deal of confusion in coalition. And that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable in the Portuguese-speaking world. Thank you, sir. You went through an apprenticeship period in the Senate. And we know that you were a political sociologist. You've been 28 years in the chamber. So why didn't Bolsonaro draw the same conclusions as you in regard to the need to have some dialogue with Congress? Well, Bolsonaro, I mean, in my days, it was very different. You could have been kind of put up against the wall, but militaries, after all, whether you're a lieutenant or a commander, there's a different level. I mean, they're not all the same, but 20 years in Congress, yes. I was prime minister, I was a senator, I was, didn't mean a great deal at the time, but I learned how to use modern instruments, internet, etc. And so that falls outside the parliamentary game. But my experience came from being a senator, but nowadays, whether you're a governor or not, I don't know if it's the same. He was also a deputy, but I always thought that the game was a legitimate political game with democracy because you needed support. But Bolsonaro seems to be the opposite. He's terribly silent, not much political visibility or not much in performance, but he's president. So how is he going to govern? He has a political base that he managed to acquire through some kind of negotiation. But with the military, his government is very precarious. Why? Because this type of support. And when the government is weak, it doesn't have any political leadership. You've got soldiers, you've just got military tactics. If we go, remember Allende's government, you need, a nation needs support within it. You've got to have economic bases, yes, but it's fundamental to understand that how to lead a country, how to, in the complexity of Brazil, you've got to understand what the power struggle is. You've got to understand these values, and you've got to play your hand with that. And if we want to keep democracy, you've got to talk to the Senate. You've got to talk to the media. You've got to talk to the people to explain what you're doing. I've repeated that. I'm sorry, but he doesn't probably have, well, you're saying he didn't have experience, but he did have experience, but he doesn't really use the past to learn. And it's difficult. There's so many differences. If only he could avoid the divergences in society. So the general feeling, or this doubt we have in Brazil is where are we going? What is the route forward? Force, what's he going to use force? What kind of force? Well, we've got 209 million people. I mean, how are you, it's not even the same population. It should be a happy ending, but I'm not entirely sure it will be. President, talking about support bases, there's a block of center parties, center right, which make a composition with all presidents. They call it the Central. And they've been there, Vice President Marc Marcial, who had a fundamental role to play in your government. That was the FL at the time. How do you assess Bolsonaro and his relationship with this important Central bloc? Because it's such a polarized Brazil at the moment. Well, the following, when I was a young man, when I was in the University Council in Sao Paulo, I was an assistant there. There was an old professor from the Polytechnic College who used to say the following: don't be afraid of the nasty guys. You always got to hold on to your own values. And the whole life, it won't always be like that, but I always remember him saying that. So if you are going to preside as a president in a country as diverse as Brazil, you've got to listen and you've got to talk. And I think this is what is missing, this capacity on the part of Bolsonaro to talk to people. He has a clear view of, or an impulse of something that he wants to follow. And I don't really, when he speaks, he doesn't speak freely. He's authoritarian in his approach. So I think this is the underlying problem. The difficulty is a contemporary one. It's not easy to govern in days like today. In my time, we had a program, we had television, but we didn't have internet. Now, if you go to France, and this was 88, south of France, and I had people there that I knew. Well, the radio and the TV began to talk about a strike. CGT, the French unions, the students came out. This was in 68, and you could see what state the country was in through the social media at the time. But today it would be very different. You've got your own instrument in hand. You've got this mobile phone right with you, and you're on the internet. So stable structures like unions, etc., are dispensed with. The movement is ongoing. It's not easy to govern in today's world. Bolsonaro was born with this television grouping, and also with internet. He's young enough, but he has difficulty. I mean, society is nervous. In the current state of affairs, we've been anesthetized by the pandemic. But when it ends, there's going to be a very diverse world. It's going to be very different. The economics are going to rule, but everybody will have this little instrument in their hand. Everybody knows what's going on. You can't hide anything. You cannot hide. So how can you govern a democratic society when everybody is connected, everybody is linked up? Like Descartes, you know, all these old philosophies are wonderful, but today I'm connected with this little instrument. And if you're not connected, you don't exist. So the government is disconnected. Well, it's connected, but it's got this instrument in its hand, but it's not connected with the Congress. It's not connected with the economic world, with the rest of the world. China, we know China exists. And it's not easy to govern in this crisis of representative democracy. Okay, the lack of leadership, but at the same time, you've got to look at the economic problems and unemployment, and of course the pandemic, and what's going to happen when it ends. This crisis of representative democracy, the policies we have don't keep up with the speed at which people go. And this leads to a great deal of confusion, not just this country. So this is the underlying issue. There's incapacity to conduct a national policy. And you know, the circuit is so fast and you've got to get onto that circuit. Since you said that when the pandemic goes away, are you going to have what's the agenda going to be post pandemic? How is Bolsonaro going to be able to, with 9 military leaders and out of 22 out of the 23 or 21 out of the 23, I mean, how is he going to operate? How is he going to be proactive and pro-productive after the pandemic? This government was elected with the idea that the Treasury has this aim, this vision, and the vision is adjusted at one point before the pandemic, but now, of course, they were going to deal with the economic crisis, but there are many difficulties. We haven't got the resources now. We're going to be spending more. We, like all countries, are going to come out of this more indebted than they were before. So the project that Bolsonaro had is contra reality. He invented the project. You know, he invents history. So the capacity, not just the government, but also the opposition, to try and imagine how economically, politically, and socially we're going to survive in Brazil, and to know which route we're going to take. How are we going to grow? The current government wants to open up the economy, I think, but I think they have some doubts about the policy they're going to use. But it's going to depend on trust, confidence. You've got to establish confidence. It's important, whatever the situation. You've got to have trust in the government, and to create this, you know, if an investor comes along, you're going to say, don't put your money here, put it somewhere else. And it happens quickly. So I think this is a complicated issue. And I think right now, we have got to have some kind of cohesion, coalition, work together. The enemy shouldn't exist. You don't need more enemies. You've got to get everyone together and imagine. I know what I'd like to see happen, that someone comes up with a project for Brazil, which would be important, including the social angle, no exclusion, and to see how we can bring the economy forward and create confidence, at least establish a route forward. And the military that you mentioned, the military, are those that Bolsonaro knows. Some of them have some training. Some of them have some training, indeed.
Background as structure management, but maybe they don't have political or economic view. Today, you need to play within the power. What would that be? President Bolsonaro anticipated himself in a way of being attached to the United States, some of words. Brazil exports a lot to United States, Europe, and China. That's a fact. You can't choose just one of them. You have to play with the three of them. And the military force, they have an advantage. That is a fact. They know Brazilian reality. It's not enough. They should also have a view regarding the world to be able to play. Will they be able to do this type of transformation? I'm not sure. But that doesn't mean they are legitimate in terms of being the stewards of our country. We need someone to do that, and that's what I see. I myself don't have a sentiment against the military force. No, that's not the fact, but they're made of another type of material. That's a fact also. And of course they have real knowledge of several things, but they were not made to play the power of politics. That's a fact also. Just to simplify, it's the play of power. Just a comment, President, you said that Bolsonaro is not aligned. I don't think Bolsonaro is not aligned, but he is aligned with Donald Trump. That is a fact. How does the United States election affect the last 2 years regarding Bolsonaro's administration? For example, if Biden wins. Oh, I'm rooting for Biden, that's a fact. If he wins, it's going to be difficult because Trump has this America First view. But Bolsonaro knows that he can't say Brazil first. The advantage of Trump is that the United States is very powerful. I don't think it's good for Brazil or the world. What's going to take place in the United States is very important for our future, not just for us, just not regarding the United States, but also the entire world. An advantage of Brazil is that we are far away from the United States, China, and Europe, which are the poles of power. I used to have an uncle at the time of Getúlio Vargas many years ago, and what did Getúlio said? He pretended that he was going to join the Nazi, but he joined the Americans. So he had a more powerful way of playing. You have to be aligned with Brazil. That's what Getúlio did. And when Bolsonaro anticipates the internal game of the United States, I think he's making a mistake. Because what if Biden wins? Then he'll be in a delicate situation. So, of course, I have my preferences, my personal preferences, but you cannot transform your personal preference in law. The interest of the country, the interest of the Brazilian people and of the economy should be the priority. That's a fact. Okay, so like left wing, right wing, they have roles, this type of ideology, but the world today is more pragmatic. What is the president going to offer us? Jobs, health. People want, that's what people want. In Brazil, we have the pandemic, unemployment, and to make things worse, a political confusion. The population becomes frightened. Of course, there's a small group that's going to track this, but most people don't know. They just want to take care of our own lives. And the president has to think of everyone, not just this little group that actually follows the politics, but everyone. He has to deal with it, and that's also applied throughout the world. Trump has to deal with the entire population of the United States. In England also. So we have to be more prudent in this sense. So we have two advantages. And the first one is that we're far away from the powerful centers. And the other thing is that the ministry international relationships, it didn't have a very ideological view of things. It's not our tradition to have Itamaraty, which is our foreign relationships department. It's not our tradition to be ideological. But now it is. That's a shame. But now changing a bit. Thank you, Mr. President. Now changing a bit the subject, we're going to talk about social policy. Thinking about the social policies that you have implemented from 1995 to 2002, what was the legacy that you left for the following governments, and how do you evaluate the continuation of these policies? So what do we have in the 90s? First, globalization, as it's called, actually took place. It's what some people like to call new liberalism. That's what, but we also had a very huge inflation. That's why I was elected president, because when I was the Ministry of Finance, I was able to control this huge inflation and reduce it. And without this inflation, you stopped penalizing the poor like inflation usually do. So there were some very key issues. First was the agricultural reform. When I was a child, for example, we had this line: if Brazil ends or ants will end Brazil. Ants, known as the saúvas, which are the big ants we have in Brazil here. At my time, it was different. When I was president, it was, we have to end inflation, or inflation will destroy Brazil. So it was very important, the main issue. And the second, another very important issue, every child has to be in school. And I had only one minister of education throughout my entire government, only one minister of finance throughout my entire government. And that was something that made our politics, helped our politics be very solid. I'm a sociologist. I do matter about the social issues. So what reality did I have to face? Agricultural reform, second place, employment, third place, health, and fourth, education. That's what we had to do at that time. You can't do everything, that's a fact. So then when we had President Lula, and what did he do? He talked a lot against me, but he continued following my social policies that I implemented. So the Bolsa Familia, it's a continuation of Bolsa Escola. Bolsa Familia by Lula, Bolsa Escola by myself, but he unified Bolsa Escola with the other social policies. He did do that. But we started that also at the end of our government. And he understood that, he united all of them and created the Bolsa Familia, which was a huge leap for the social well-being of the population. That's a fact. President Dilma wasn't that lucky, because first, I think she had a more academic view than a more pragmatic view, a realistic view. That's what I understand. Because Lula was always very competent in dealing with people. He doesn't have an educational background, but he learned a lot from life, and he's very skilled at dealing with people. But President Dilma's government was a bit more difficult. Then there was also international crisis that she faced. Brazil stopped growing because of these international crises. And then we had the impeachment. Then we had President Temer. President Temer tried to make it right. It was very difficult because population wasn't backing him. That's a fact. He wasn't well seen. So, but he tried to make things right. So I would say that in certain ways there was a rupture. In other policies, in some policies there were a rupture. In other policies there were continuity. And now I don't know if this is going to work, because the Minister of Education, he says some things that make no sense at all. So it's very difficult to believe that education will improve like this. In terms of the Minister of Education is the third Minister of Education we have since the pandemic began. So you can't do anything by making people leave, by changing ministers all the time. You need time to consolidate. I see we are working in terms of, it's as almost if we were improvising, and that does not work. You can't get anything done if not across time, because it takes time for people to understand. And for example, the agricultural reform is not much a big issue anymore. Now the main issue is to support agriculture with special programs and so on. So I understand that the Congress approved a project that will have good consequences. It will supply some income, basic income to everyone. I voted in favor at the time of Suplici's program, which is very similar to this one, of providing a basic income to everyone. But if we look at what's happening in Brazil now, our society is very unequal. Inequality here became natural. That's the problem. Because I was a sociologist, that I went to the field. I didn't stay only at the college, at university. I understood several, and I studied and went to several different religious centers, went to favelas. I know poverty, to me, is not only in theory. I see it and it makes me angry, and it's difficult. When I was a senator, I created a project which was to tax the great fortunes. I asked Senator Roberto Campos, who was a conservative, but I was very antagonized because of this project. That's a fact. It's as if the world would catch fire because they couldn't see the poverty. They only knew it in theory. We're never going to be a great country with that level of inequality we have in Brazil. That's enough. We can't take it anymore. The virus, the coronavirus, came to Brazil by plane. It's catched first into the upper middle class, the rich, but now it has reached the poor people, the favelas, people that live in crowded houses with 4, 5, 6 people living in the houses. So who's dying now? The poor. So it's very visible that we cannot continue like this with this large inequalities in terms of income. So of course we have to think about the economy, but we also have to think about the social aspects. And remember, always maintain freedom. You mentioned the creation of the basic income, emergency income, because of the pandemic. Do you think that this changes the narrative in the future when we debate about social policies, politics, toward a permanent creation of this type of income? Yes, I think that can happen. I think that it's something that we didn't even think about not so far ago, but it also depends on the politics. Who is going to do this? Who's going to express this and have the populations, win the population's trust, and the trust also of the powerful ones, and make people understand it's important for the country and not for the specific people receiving it. It's necessary to have a stronger market. That's a fact. And I hope that happens. And why is that universal income being talked about everywhere? Also because of unemployment and the Congress has said that it's going to deal with this. For me, is that we have this, on the long run, a society that demands more from the government. Now, regarding status versus economy, it's a false dilemma. We have a market economy. Even China is a market economy. It's a false dilemma. But that doesn't mean you don't need public politics. The market itself demands public politics. There should be, as the European Democrats, Social Democrats, the German Social Democrats, they say we need an economy based on the market, but we also need social policy, social sciences. Bolsonaro, he's not going to understand that, but he has a Ministry of Finance, he has to understand that. But a Minister of Finance that doesn't do it based on improvisation, how it's being done now. We need a person that has a more inclusive view, that includes everyone in this politics based on values that are based on social politics. So I'm completely in favor of having a permanent universal basic income. Great, President. Now we are at the end of our interview. I just want to make a more open question to you now. If you could give some advice to the current president of Brazil, what would that advice be? First, I don't think he's going to listen to me. That's a fact. I would say your adversary is not an enemy. We need cohesion. We need to unite. It's enough. All this antagonism is enough. We can't do that anymore. It's better to be applauded than to be booed. And the risk of all governments is to be booed. Thank you very much, Mr. President. We thank your participation here a lot as the first guest of Brazil Forum UK 2020, and it's always amazing to talk to you. Thank you very much. No, I thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you and to talk to the people that are listening to us from the other side. And I hope they are plenty. And I think we have to always have hope. Create a future without hope is terrible. So that's perfect. Julia, please. It's the words with you again, Julia.
Welcome once again to the 5th Brazil-UK Forum in the UK, with the distinguished participation of Dilma Rousseff, who's accepted our invitation to discuss public governance in times of crisis. For our foreign public, just an introduction, Dilma Rousseff was President of Brazil between 2011 and 2016 and was the first woman to occupy that post. On behalf of the Brazil Forum UK Forum, I'd like to thank you very much for being with us, President. I would also like to thank you for your invitation, Julia, and to say it's a great pleasure for me to be back in the forum. This forum always brings to us fundamental subjects for discussion, particularly for my country. Thank you very much. And beside me, once again, I've got the lecturer in Brazilian Studies at the University of Oxford, Timothy Power. He's going to be conducting the interview. So when you would like to begin, please do so. I would also like to say hello to Timothy Power. Yes, nice to see you again, Timothy. Thank you very much, President. It is a great pleasure to be with you once again to conduct this interview. I'd like to remind the public that apart from being the former President of the Republic of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff also has a vast experience in public policy, which is going to be very practical for us in discussing the topics we have before us today at the interview. Dilma was the Treasury Secretary of Porto Alegre. She was the Secretary of Energy of Rio Grande do Sul. She was Minister of Energy. She was the Chief of Staff, and she was elected in 2014. So, President, it is a great pleasure for us to have you with us, and it was on the last occasion at St. Anthony's College 2 years ago. That was in 2018. And the last time I had the pleasure of listening to you was when you spoke in the amphitheater of the Sorbonne in September, a setting somewhat more luxurious than my home office here in Oxford. So, great pleasure. And Dilma says she too is at home. So, President, I'd like to begin by talking about governance in times of crisis. Brazil had a crisis in the 90s. That was a monetary crisis. In 2008, there was the financial crisis, and today we have the pandemic, which is the crisis that comes on top of the economic crisis of 2020. So, President, what would from your experience as President, what would be the first steps to be taken when you realize such a crisis is approaching? Well, Timothy, I think that this crisis, like many other crises that we faced, not only here in Brazil, but that have affected the whole world. We had the crisis that led to the First World War, and from that we had the major crisis of 29, the crisis that led to the Second World War and its consequences, and there are always consequences. And the events that occur do accentuate trends that are already underway, and in many cases they add, through the radicalization of these trends, they lead to other crises. The case of the First World War in relation to the Second World War. Now, this crisis, this one is different. This one is different to 2008. 2008, it had a certain duration and it had repercussions that popped up a number of times. For example, it had repercussions in the Euro crisis in 2012, 13, and 14. And it, of course, had an effect in Brazil and other emerging countries, in India and Russia, and that was in 2014. But this crisis, this COVID crisis, this is going to be seen from 3 points of view. The first is the capacity of the state, understood to be the state, not the government, the state, to confront the crisis. That is, the structures that the state has available the structure of public health, the structure for providing credit to be able to save companies, the social protection, the network of social protection that exists. So one has to assess the capacity of the state. What is also going to be necessary is to assess the capacity of the government and civic society. The government in the policies that it's developing to confront the crisis, and there's also going to be a need to assess the leadership, because leadership to confront a crisis is absolutely essential for governability. Now, what are we seeing at the moment? This crisis has affected all countries in the world. There are differences in terms of the performance in these countries that can help explain why some seem to be doing better, some perform better and more effective and more efficient than others. In the case of Brazil, what obviously I'm going to talk about, Brazil, we have a problem. And it was already happening, the dismantling of the state, because it was thought it was getting excessive, similar to what has happened before. So there was a dismantling of policies that the Brazilian state had already built up over time. Clearly, this dismantling had already begun under the Temer government. So this had an effect on health policy, reducing spending on health, because there was a constitutionalization of austerity that had been approved. This was known as a ceiling for spending, and there was a limit to spending, which really was less than what was actually before obligatory as spending. So there was a flexibility introduced to spending, and this made clear that, of course, there would be an interest to pay on this. With the dismantling of social policies, and I'm going to emphasize this point of health, because this is very important. Brazil came out of 1998 with a single health service that was built on the model of the United Kingdom, the National Health Service, greatly inspired by that system. And that system was to be universal, it was to be free of charge, and it was to be a quality service. In a country with 204 million, more or less at that time, different variations of population number, it was very difficult in a country of that size in an emerging country, to build up a health service of that scope, but it was fundamental. And I would like to stress how much has been stolen from that system under Temer and under Bolsonaro. All the Cuban doctors, for example, 11,000 Cuban doctors, with another 7,000 doctors were expelled. For 18,000, we had 18,000 doctors in Brazil who were looking after millions of people, way beyond what the WHO would recommend. So what happened? The Temer government, rather discreetly, decided to reduce, and Bolsonaro, of course, pursued this, and the Cuban doctors were expelled from Brazil. They left. So this was a perverse way of dealing with things, and this was on the eve of the crisis, where they were dismantling the primary healthcare system. Yes. So this was very serious. And the same with welfare, with social protection. This is something terrible. What is happening in Brazil at the moment is terrible. We were trying to move towards formalizing labor and trying with everything we could. But of course, there's now been a reduction in welfare payment. And the Temer government, and then partly by the Bolsonaro government, you find that we have now installed a labor reform, which means that there is a more precarious situation with labor now. The trend towards the informal labor sector in an emerging country is accentuated by this whole process of making jobs non-contract, short-term contract, and precarious. And this is extremely difficult for a population that's already fragile and vulnerable. Yeah. So if I look at the government now, it's even worse. They're adopting a neoliberal policy, the type of, which I would call belonging to the prehistory, when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth, because dismantling the national state, and mainly the capacity of the state to provide coverage for people, then all the monsters jump out of Pandora's box. And this is a crisis that hits us while we are already fragile. And the government, the situation, it's a neo-fascist approach that works on the basis of the polarization of society. Instead of creating... President, may I interrupt? Can I ask? Could I just finish, please? Just give me another couple of minutes. I just want to complete this. I think the polarization of that the Bolsonaro government is now establishing, again, looking at political adversaries as enemies. There's a policy of hate, of violence, and this policy, this approach is going to lead to fascist practices, violence, intolerance. And this is going to be accentuated. So Brazil, from the point of view of the government, is facing times when polarization is at a peak. And thirdly, the third aspect, the president completely ignores the problems. He's trying to attach blame to the governors. He is not a leader. He's not showing leadership. He is unable to realize that there is a disease circulating. So this is exceedingly serious politically and also in terms of governability. Thank you, Madam President. Talking about political polarization, a number of observers, both in Brazil and also outside Brazil, are talking about a possible escalade of authoritarianism in the country. And I'd like to hear your opinion on whether you think that this is the case and whether you think that the Brazilian institutions will be able to resist this escalation of authoritarianism. Well, I think this possibility of an escalation of authoritarianism is already underway. The Bolsonaro government, particularly the president, is using this. He's using the strategy of these different approaches. And this is a strategy also supported by the Vice President, General Mourão, who was installed in 2017. This is a strategy of excessive approach to this type of government. When you say totalitarian escalation, how can you do that today? Because the institutions will resist. Both the Congress, the Supreme Court, civic society, the unions, etc. All the different entities of civil society are going to resist. So how can you set up that kind of strategy? And this is what Bolsonaro is doing every week. You are making progress here with radicalization of these policies. And there's a reaction now from society. Once again, you go another step forward. You get reaction from society. But it's kind of like a step forward, a step back. This is the normalization many authoritarian regimes, Nazism and Italian fascism, adopted this approach. That is, they move in steps. They reduce the resistances. They normalize violence. In the case of Brazil, a number of topics that were unheard of until recently. For example, military intervention, the defense of military dictatorship. And this was a final turning point way back in 64, the coup we had in 64. The final coup was, of course, the closing of Congress, and all freedoms, democratic freedoms, were eliminated. And that was what happened in 65. The military government took over. Now, what's happening is that I think there's a problem within the government, a problem right at the base of the government. It's sustainability, and this is beginning to show cracks. It's formed by a group that has an authoritarian view and practically neo-fascist view. They defend violence, militias, and so on. So it's a ridiculous policy in terms of culture, education, intervention in the universities, data that's hiding the number of deaths in Brazil. And at the same time, you have those who ally with this to adopt neoliberal reform. So 4 consecutive elections, the agenda had to be changed. So what's happening is that the neoliberal wing, which is conservative, not neo-fascist, they think that when Bolsonaro would assume the presidency, he would then be moderate. He would be controllable. But what happens is that neo-fascism doesn't have a moderation chip in it. It never did have. So what's happening, Bolsonaro is automized himself, and it's becoming ridiculous. Part of the Brazilian right broke away from neo-fascism, but they sustain Guedes neoliberalism. So what's happening, there are limits to so much, because today, to try and introduce neoliberal reforms, you've got Bolsonaro there. There's always a feeling of discomfort. How come we can't get there with an impeachment against him? All the items that characterize the crime of irresponsibility are there. Something that never happened to me. They never managed to pin a crime of irresponsibility on me. And today there's an article that's been published that shows how you get, you've got a certain balance. You've got the Court of Accounts, and you've got examining Lula and Henrique and Bolsonaro's accounts, but the only criminal or the only crimes have been proved are mine. So what's going on today? I do not believe that there are conditions for Bolsonaro to be impeached on the one hand, and I don't think he can make an auto coup to call in the armed forces. Strictly speaking, Bolsonaro's government is a militarized government. Never, even under the military dictatorship, where there's so many generals and high-ranking officers occupying so many government places. in the ministry, yes. This has never happened before, if you look back. And even more ridiculous, I mean, it's ridiculous to have a general in charge of the Ministry of Health. I think you've got more military ministers in government, in the Bolsonaro government, than in the Figueiredo government, for example. 9 to 7. It's not only that. There were also civilians, civilian positions. You had Delfineto. You had important and strategic civilian placings. The Bolsonaro government is completely militarized. So the problem of military intervention is, in fact, a coup against democracy in Brazil. So to reply to your question, I think we have reached an impasse. That is the force. There's no force to bring down Bolsonaro. There's no force to remove his group. The structure, it makes it difficult. Even in this impasse that we're seeing today, might you consider alternatives that have been used by previous presidents? So, for example, under your presidency, where governance moved to more presidential approach. Bolsonaro said when he was elected he was going to move away from old policies and adopt new policies. Talking to Congress, but dialogue is practically broken down there. Can a Brazilian president actually drop this form of government, the traditional one? Well, from 1978, for governability in Brazil, always had to count on the democratic center, which was strategic. You had major leaderships there from the center left, even conservatives from the right. But they had a vision for the country. They had a proposal for the country. This led to governability in governments, regardless of their particular trend. But after a certain time, probably the end of the first Lula government, or it was stepped up in the second Lula government, you have you've got more political fragmentation coming in. So the center was beginning to break up into 1,000 parts. It was fragmenting. And in the major part of the center, perhaps, you have a hegemonic right-wing structure expressed in a personality who was well known under my government, and that was Eduardo Cunha. Eduardo Cunha, at the end of Lula's government, was moving. And in a growing process, he managed to become, or to bring over the Câmara, majority right-wing trend. And through a number of different processes, he created what we call the Centrão. The Centrão will never be able to have sufficient force, and that's quite clear now, to control the center. And Bolsonaro has quite clearly broken up and controls the Centrão, this central block of independence. So what's happening in Brazil? The institutional career of Brazil means that all governments that have a majority have always been more advanced up till the time of Bolsonaro. Congresses have always had a more conservative approach, illustrating the fact that national issues that were discussed, you were able to elect a chamber, a federal chamber, and a Senate that was extremely conservative. I had 130 deputies and more than 500 more. The same with Lula, Fernando Henrique. formed an alliance with DEM, which at the time was the PFN. So what do you end up with? You have this situation. And here, to combat the PT, the Labour Party, and create a climate to replace this coup approach to power, and after my second election, they began to criminalize politics and demoralize politics. And when you do that, when you demoralize or criminalize politics, you've got two possibilities. Either somebody that are not parties or functioning as parties in Brazil, it's the case of Globo, which is visibly a political party, and currently the armed forces that, of course, have a project for taking over power, apart from what happened in the car wash scandal. So you've got a field that is absolutely mined. When Bolsonaro talks about the old politics, if the new politics, the fascist politics, because this story between the old politics and the new, there's a whole new way of valuing things. So the fascism of Bolsonaro is older than the center politics in Brazil. The fascist tradition used to exist in Brazil. I could tell you about the roots of it. It goes, you can trace it right from slavery. The Brazilian elite is elite vis-a-vis the people, and this led to a certain way of those that use, as happens in all Europe, those that use the failings of the establishment to propose populist right-wing policies. So I think this story of the old politics and the new politics is just a facade raised by Bolsonaro. But the Centrão, this central bloc, is more fits better into the framework of democracy than neo-fascism does. Neo-fascism So you might ask me how we got here. I would summarize that by saying when the objective was to destroy the Labour Party, the PT, they investigated, they seized, they demonized the PT. All the other parties never suffered this process of demonization. The members of the PT who were being, or the PSD, when they were investigated, they were never imprisoned. Just wait a minute, I want to finish this. The center-right, the right, and in the center. And this opened terrain for Bolsonaro to move in. It's like an alchemy. But he got majority voting quite in 2018 he got a very, very large vote, but he has destroyed himself because of his ambition, and I would say by his seduction, his eye on a coup. I'm afraid Timothy's sound has dropped, so you were talking about this Central. How would you assess this central bloc, this Central, and what has changed in this political center since democratization, and what are the challenges of your government vis-a-vis this Central when it comes to what goes on in Parliament? The democratic center of was significant. It had a number of quite distinguished measures from the PSDB and the PMDB. But then it exploded into the Collor government and the Henrique government. Exploded how? It fragmented into other parties. And then you get the PSDB, the PP, a whole series of parties. The center is another center. It's not that it's not democratic. It's not democratic in the progressive sense of democracy. The center that led to building democracy way back in 1968, but it moved progressively to the right. And this whole process reached its peak with the arrival of Eduardo Cunha's control. His control of this center. He didn't just co-opt parties that didn't really belong to him. We know, for example, in fact, it's quite infamous, and you get this in records, that he was actually financing a whole series of different leaderships. And he built up this hegemony, this conservative hegemony that we face. He followed. He was against women. He was against gender. He had a very conservative policy and ultra-liberal in terms of economy. You can't underestimate the effects of Bolsonaro, not Bolsonaro, sorry, says Dilma Rousseff, Cunha, on politics within the Congress and this central bloc. You can't underestimate it. They didn't, at the same time, they didn't become fascists. They were extremely right, but they were not fascists. What Bolsonaro is doing, and it's only possible because this whole process of destroying the PT, the Labour Party, because the objective was to destroy the PT and implant neoliberal reforms. And they achieved this. But how? With Temer and with the car wash scandal, where, you know, friends get into leading positions. So when we got to the 2018 elections, all the centre candidates, the centre right, the traditional right, they were completely and utterly, they collapsed. The whole party was destroyed from the point of view of what the PSDB was and what the 2018 elections produced. Think they got such a high percent, they're going to repeat this, the presidential election. I'm talking about the presidential election, of course. And this is serious, because in destroying the center-right, then you get another right appearing. Bolsonaro was the only alternative to install neoliberalism. So, hence this alliance that goes on today in Brazil, trying to come back to a democratic process when you've broken down everything that's been built up, and Bolsonaro is responsible here. President, coming back to the relationship of you with this Central, what were the challenges at the time, apart from the impeachment? And what possibilities were there at the time? And what did you learn from that time in the relationship with the Central? Well, how I can describe my relationship with Central? I maintained a cohesion policy, which I followed, and this cohesion was coming to an end. It was weakening. So when I was elected for my second mandate in February of 2000, and then 2014, I was elected, I had Eduardo Cunha was elected to the chamber. And Eduardo Cunha, he hegemonized the center. My relationship with him was extremely tense, contradictory, and sometimes there were movements forward and backwards. He didn't let me pass anything. And this was in the National Congress. An example, any increase in tax when facing the crisis Brazil was then facing, that wasn't allowed. That was considered a crime to suggest what? Taxation on excesses, on properties, on capital. We tried to get taxation on financial transactions. So the higher the transaction, then the higher the tax, obviously. And this transaction, this tax was not permitted. The major banks, due to the pressure that all those who were still trying to evade their taxation were against this, because taxation on financial transactions gains, because it is difficult to conduct a financial transaction and to evade your taxes. It's going to be discovered quickly, and you're revealed. So this is why this proposal was demonized, shall we say. I think one thing that is going to be revealed after this pandemics, again in Europe and in USA, I can see that what is coming, there will be an austerity policy, as happened in 2008. And again, taxes will rise. Given the level of inequality, of the poverty, even in the developed countries. But my relationship was extremely tense. I went from day to day with a cohesion government. Bolsonaro, it doesn't have a coalition government. Right, thank you. Can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you. Are you in England? Yes, I am in England. You were talking about tax evasion. Well, I just failed in my audio-visual duties because the line went down. We have an excellent health service, but we have to improve our internet connections. However, yeah, you need the 5G. You need a 5G system. But you know, there's this Howie question of installing your 5G. But you have to operate them with only 4G. Yeah. This actually caused a rupture in the government talking about this. They would like to continue this American orientation, some of them. However, coming back to the democratic center that you were talking about, this question of a lack of protagonism on the part of the center, is it that this center never came up with presidential candidates? I think at the last election was... No, remember. Yes, there were candidates. There were present in the last elections. Social democracy in Brazil, like any other, we've got the PSDB, and it did put forward candidates. And they ran in the elections in 2013, Lula, and so on. Lula twice, and then it was me. There was Senator Serra, Governor Alckmin, and Senator Aécio. But what happened was that this grouping that had a democratic progressive profile in 2014, I think they were tempted to a coup. But the president of the PSDB, who is a senator in Ceará, can't remember his name, he said that the PSDB had made 3 mistakes. The first mistake, it had been part of Temer's government. Second mistake, it had been against proposals, economic proposals to confront the crisis in my government that I always defended. And third, I think they were also, we can add, they were in favor of car wash. And car wash affected Senators Aloysio, Serra, Aécio. So they were all affected. So you know. If you judge PT candidates and members, think of the others. So it's very complicated in the center group because they were part of Temer's government. The amount of destruction that was caused due to this car wash scandal. PT was criminalized for things that nobody else suffered. Nobody else was criminalized, just the PT. So you have a situation in which destruction, it doesn't happen at the time. It has consequences in the next elections. Nobody expected. I certainly didn't expect. Very difficult anyone to realize this was going to happen. But Bolsonaro became a candidate because he was in opposition to PT. He thought it would be elections like any other, but PSDB was the major adversary. So it wasn't a surprise because at the time of disruption, you don't know what's coming. But there was a complete disruption of Brazilian politics in 2018. The consequences are not just the election of Bolsonaro, it's not just that. But he destroyed the center in Brazil. He destroyed the right in Brazil. It implodes. There's no vote. So it's a serious situation because what we think is a national party, it's got to have space within the presidential elections. And, I mean, years of democracy and PSDB is beginning to disappear without confronting as it did before, and it was traditional. Dora, for example, is not PSDB from the beginning. He's making the most of it. Yes, thank you. We haven't got too many more minutes left. I'd just like to ask you, please, to talk a little bit, just by way of conclusion, on social policies. At the start of the interview, you spoke about the destructuring of the Brazilian state over recent years. But if we assess the continuity of social policies, has For example, the single registry, didn't that survive as a tool for combating the crisis that you're confronting now? No. They destroyed the effects of this registry. I don't know to what extent they've destroyed all the instruments, but the single individual registry or registration is essential because it, of course, is made up of technology. It includes technology that allows people to have an effective policy, one that is effective socially. And why do I say this? Because even the Lula government, I mean, what was social policy up until Lula at the time? It was fairly wide-reaching. But in Brazil, you got 140 million people who earn very little in reais a month. So, you know, you're going to, if you don't cover all these millions, then you don't have a social policy. So that social policy covers 100,000 people. It's not enough. So what were we building up? We were creating the technology that would provide the individual unique record, address, how much you earned, how many children, who was the head of the family, to be able to get to those people and to have a real policy that would guarantee that their children would have a different living standard. They would have access to services, because distributing wealth isn't enough. You have also got to distribute services. You've got to ensure access to these services. I'll give you an example. Our social policies involved a number of things. We were looking and we realized there was nowhere to live, for example. Families who were often, the leader was, the head of the family was a woman. So the single record allowed us to focus on these people. We knew where they were. I was dismayed when they, with the threat of COVID, when you saw the queues of people queuing up to try and register themselves, to try and prove who they were, and to receive 600 reais. Why was I distressed? Because it didn't have to be that way. Brazil has the technology. The mistake is the family plan, the family benefit is crazy. We would never have had queues in the face of such a conflict. Another thing is that you know how the fiscal system was set up. It began with a program which had a tremendous subsidy behind it. This was removed. They saw that it wasn't going to work. Why was the problem? We wanted to focus on those families who had a woman or sometimes a couple who were the head, but they had children and they had nowhere to live. They lived in very precarious places. We know, we saw them. So the instruments were there. They haven't yet destroyed them. But I don't know, somehow some of these instruments have been destroyed. Yes, talking about these queues at the Federal Savings Bank, do you think that a basic emergency income could help people, and will it continue in the future? I'm talking about this basic salary or minimum salary. Yes, I think this can help. I think it's got to, there has to be a serious discussion and a policy on a basic minimum salary. How do you see this? How would it be funded? Where would the money come from? How would you fund a minimum salary in these conditions? I think Brazil, as well as European countries and the USA, will have to change their tax system. And this is why I don't think we can go on having these indirect taxes. I think we have to tax the top of the pyramid, because that's where the money is. We don't have money elsewhere. And that discussion that will have to be taken up again, if you're going to have reduction in tax, reduces growth and reduces productivity, then it's going to have to be regulated. We're looking to the past as well. You've got to look at what happened in the past. For example, how did the welfare state get funded in the USA and in the UK? It was funded from 1950 up until the 80s with tax rates that could go up to 80%. No, I'm not saying it's going to be 80%. I'm simply saying that 30 is not enough. 27 is not enough. Here in Brazil, a worker, lower middle class pays more tax than the Itaú Bank in proportion to the respective incomes. Because the indemnities, and I'm not just, the Financial Times talks about this as well. The Financial Times can't be accused of being a Bolivarian, using Bolivarian tactics. These taxes that you're talking about in the United Kingdom and the USA, they have changed due to the internal workings of their different governments, whether Republican or Democratic, etc. Yeah, but there was a theory in place. Could I just ask you, what will the Brazilian coalition be that will come up with taxes for the top of the pyramid? How can you build up that kind of coalition, get that agreement? I can only say the following. The situation is going to be so serious after this pandemic. So serious. We've got to consider that there are going to be bankruptcies, and I'm not just talking about basic income people or minimum income salary. How are we going to rebuild the productive fabric of the micro, small, and average size companies that have no access to capital? How is this going to move forward? What's going to happen to Timothy? There's going to be a general breakdown, and the level of poverty is going to be even higher. Those who survive will only be those who've got money in their pockets, who are really robust in financial terms. The alternative is the following: generalized unemployment, lasting unemployment, social chaos, collapse, and we don't know the consequences. The actual World Bank is listing the risks that we might be facing. And they're listing as a risk several things, and among them, greater social conflict, black marketing or grey marketing, informal marketing, the loss of capacity to generate income by people. And I think the reality is that without politics, you can't really bring these reforms about. But it's going to mean that every society is going to have to ask questions. And there will have to be responses. The situation, not just ours. I think just because I think we have to look to a reality. Let's face it, Brazil, Timothy, is going to be the epicenter of the pandemic. We might reach the levels of the USA, but in proportion, we are in a very serious situation. The consequences, the economic consequences of this situation are very, very serious, Timothy. Apparently, they want to reduce the 600 reais to 300 reais a month. And certainly, COVID is going to last for some time, even if we come up with a vaccine or some kind of medical treatment by the end of the year, or the start of next year or the middle of next year. The crisis, the economic crisis, I think is going to be greater. It is going to last for far longer. It is going to drag on. And the longer it drags on, the more serious will be the situation of countries like Brazil, because I think that here, the response to the crisis may, after the isolation and the madness, might be able to build things up throughout the crisis. But without doing that, yeah, of course.
Sem dúvida que
Yes, the pandemic is certainly going to have reverberations and make economic survival very difficult. Now, we're coming...
Isso, exatamente.
Unfortunately, we're coming to the conclusion of our interview. I would like to thank you so very much for answering these questions, particularly on tax, because one of the reasons for an event like this is to be able to think about the post-pandemic stage and solutions. But to conclude the interview, could I just ask you one more thing? Please continue. Yes.
Sim.
President, my final question is, if you could give some advice to the current president of Brazil, what advice would you give him? Defend the lives of people, the life of people, the health of people, the subsistence of people and companies. Defend all of that. Change your ideas, because this defense is our future. Whoever defends the lives of Brazilians looks to the future, and Brazilian lives, black lives as well. This is one of the important things, but particularly for Brazil, which is a racist country that, of course, has slavery in its past, as we all know. But lives, all lives, are important. And they carry the future. And this is the future we have to guarantee. Reducing deaths to a minimum. This is an obligation of the government to look after people, to avoid more deaths and its high numbers of deaths, and systematically to do testing, prevent people from exposing themselves to risk. And therefore you have to help to keep people at home, to give them the necessary to be able to stay there, to companies and to people. This is the only advice that you can give to the president of the republic in any part of the world, any president. Protect life. And this is the fight. It's legitimate, it's correct, and morally, anything else is indefensible. And this is why, from my point of view, respect for others, because without democracy, you won't manage it. President, thank you very much. That's an excellent message to conclude our interview. On behalf of the organizers, this has been an immense honor to receive you here on the Brazil-UK Forum. And personally, as a Brazilian lover and lecturer, then I can only thank you for your readiness and your patience with my Portuguese, and also with the technical problems here in the UK. So once again, thank you so much for taking part today. Thank you. Oh, Timothy, I'd just like to say that your Portuguese is wonderful. And these technical problems, everybody confronts them. So I'd like to thank you very much for having me. I know we've had a lot of contacts. Always a pleasure to have someone who is such a student of Brazilian as you are. So I'd like to thank Julia as well. for her participation and for having ensured the continuation of the interview despite technical problems. That's not a problem, really. Thank you.
Obrigado.
Right. Big hug to all of you. Thank you very much, Madam President. I'd like to thank the team for also working with us, and Susanna and Iris's interpreters for English. And we've just had an interview with former President Dilma Rousseff and Timothy Power, University of Oxford. And I would like you all to take a look at our programming on Wednesday. There will be a debate on the future of the Brazilian health system. But you can see all of this on the website. Again, our events begin at 17 hours in Brazil and 21 hours here in London. Thank you all very much. Thank you all for taking part. And I hope to see you next Wednesday. Thank you all very much indeed. Goodbye.